Hello and welcome to the European Respiratory Journal podcast. My name is James Chalmers and I'm the chief editor of the European Respiratory Journal. Every month we pick out a highlight from the journal to dive deeply with the author, ask questions, discuss the science and try and understand a bit more about what's been published in the journal. This month we're focusing on interstitial lung disease and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Marlies Weissenbeek, who's going to talk to us about Nerandomilast in ILD. This is a secondary analysis of a trial that was published previously in the New England Journal of Medicine with some really interesting and provocative results. So welcome, Marlies.
Hi, James. Thank you for the introduction and great to be here.
We get a whole range of people listening to this podcast, including ILD experts and people who are not, super familiar with the new drugs in ILD. So maybe kick off by introducing to us what is Nerandomilast, what does it do, and therefore what was the objective of the study?
Nerandomilast is a selective phosphodiesterase 4B inhibitor, and that has anti-fibrotic, anti-inflammatory, but also some vascular properties. And the initial study, the FibroNER ILD, was designed as a randomized placebo-controlled trial in 1,176 patients with progressive pulmonary fibrosis. And progressive pulmonary fibrosis is a term that describes patients with different forms of fibrosis, non-IPF, that have a progression of disease despite conventional management. And these patients were included and received in a 3-arm study, either 18 milligrams of nerandomilast twice a day, 9 milligrams twice a day, or placebo twice a day. And the main results of this overarching study, the primary endpoint, was published last year, like you said, and that was the forced vital capacity at 52 weeks that was slowed down by both doses of nerandomilast.
And so what was the purpose of this secondary analysis and what did you find?
Yeah, the interesting of the design of this study was that the patients remained after this 52 weeks primary endpoint first database lock, they remained randomized and blinded in the study, which allowed that there was a longer follow-up of these patients, which allows also for more events. So in this study now here, what we report is on endpoints that are particularly meaningful for patients, such as acute exacerbations, hospitalizations, and like you said, very important mortality. This study showed that both doses of nerandomilast were associated with a risk reduction in death compared with placebo of halving it, so a 51% reduction in death. And that was mainly driven by fewer respiratory-related deaths. So I think that is a major finding for this trial.
Yeah, so a 51% reduction in mortality to me sounds extremely important. Put this in some context for us within the ILD literature, because nerandomilast is not the first antifibrotic for ILD, IPF, PPF. How does this compare to other antifibrotics in terms of effects on survival?
Unfortunately, all the previous trials have never shown an effect on mortality. That was because we always thought it would be very complex to design this trial. You would need massive amount of patients, very long trials. So only in post hoc analysis or pre-specified analysis of pooled data, you would see a signal on mortality. And this is really for the first time that a prospective placebo-controlled trial shows this effect on mortality. So I think that is a major step, not only in the treatment for patients, but also in our trial design and thinking of how we should further develop and study further drugs.
Obviously, the longer term follow-up allows you to look at other endpoints as well, including safety. And it's always important when we talk about new drugs to talk about safety. Anything to say there and how this compares to the other antifibrotics, which do have some side effects?
Overall, the safety signal here was consistent with the primary endpoint to 52 weeks, so there were no major changes here. And what you see is that it compares very favorable with the existing antifibrotics, with having much lesser side effects. There is still the side effect of diarrhea, which occurs more in patients with nerandomilast, and especially in the patients being on background therapy in combination with nintedanib. That said, if you looked in this trial on discontinuation rates because of adverse events, that was equal across all arms, around 12%, which is, I think, very encouraging.
That's great. And you mentioned there, the next key question, which is people in this trial could be on background other antifibrotics or could be naive to antifibrotics. So how did the data look in those two groups, sort of leaning towards how this might be used in future in clinical practice?
Yeah, that's an important question. In this question, 44% of patients were on background antifibrotic treatment, nintedanib, because that is licensed for PPF. And what you see here, and if you look at the signal, is actually that the patients not on background therapy seem to have a non-significant but numerical more favorable effect. I do think that is explained because the patients already had some effect of nintedanib, so it will be more difficult to find a difference. If you would translate that to clinical practice, I think that is where the main challenges now lay. What this trial shows is that it works both in patients without background therapy, but also in combination therapy. What the trial does not show is how should we start that and how should we use it? Should we go upfront double like in the PH field? Should we first start one, then at another if there is failure? I think the easy thing is if patients don't tolerate a current drug, you have a drug now to switch to. So that's the easy question. But that is something I think that we need to investigate. And we can probably also maybe learn from the PH field on how to do that.
This is all very real now because as I understand, it got EMA approval in May and it's been used in the US for some time. But this is a very rapidly shifting landscape, isn't it? We've also seen the report of the TETON trials with inhaled treprostinil also showing substantial benefit in this population. So it seems like there's a lot of new therapies coming for ILD. How are we going to get to the answer to your question in terms of when to initiate, which to initiate first, combination versus single drugs? Difficult question, I know, but important one, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it is a difficult question, but it is something that is work in progress. There are currently projects set up, grants drafted. I know also in the US they're doing that as well. But I do think we have to look at it if upfront double therapy is better than no monotherapy, and maybe the next step also versus triple therapy, but that will be next. What is also important, I think now what weighs in is patient preferences, because we also have to be honest, all of these drugs slow down the disease decline. We now also have an effect on mortality that is important, but nevertheless, patients are still dying. So tolerability of drugs is also very important if you have to long-term take these drugs, and patient voices will also weigh in. And I think in that sense, it might also be very nice to listen to the podcast with this article where patient representatives are also interviewed to give their view on how they look on these data.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine, and I know because I've listened to the podcast, that this is extremely important. This, as you said, is the first to show in a randomized study a mortality benefit, which is, feels, functions, and survives, the most important endpoint, survival. But you enrolled over 1,000 patients to get there. I mean, is this feasible as an endpoint that people should be targeting in future studies of antifibrotics? I mean, you've set a bar now that there's a drug that can reduce mortality. Patients say this is what we want. Is that something that should be front and center for future ILD PPF trials?
I think it's good to realize that FVC is an accepted surrogate for mortality, so that we probably are stuck with that. That said, it is also that the margins with more effective drugs to find a signal are becoming smaller and smaller. And so I think the design of trials is becoming more and more complex. And we have to find the reality on if future trials are going to work on background of two drugs. Can you have combination therapy and then on top of that? So that is challenging, but we just had a meeting also with representatives from around the world, but also from policymakers, pharma companies, patients, to look at new designs for phase 2 trials. And I hope that there will also be proceedings coming out of that to further guide the field in this, because this is not an easily answered question, but we should not throw the FVC away. We should also keep in patient-reported outcomes, but so far those have been challenging to show a signal in these trials. And I think we have to think of, this more prolonged design so that we have more events. And even if those are nominally statistically significant, I think they are still very valuable and really matter for patients and physicians when talking about these drugs.
Really great, Marlies. So what's next? The drug's on the market, but there's obviously still lots of questions.
Yeah.
Is there anything from the data you think you would like to highlight that I haven't asked you about? And if not, what are the next unanswered questions? What are the studies that need to be done now that this drug is out in the world?
Oh no, I think there are always millions of questions. So we already alluded to the important one of combinations of timing of drugs and everything. But I think another thing that came up in this trial is the effect on mortality that is not linearly related to the effect on FVC. So what does this drug do beyond an effect on FVC? Is it an effect on vasculature? Is it an effect that we don't know yet? So I think that would also be very interesting to investigate, because it also might yield targets for future therapies or expansion of use of this drug. So I think that is something that we should definitely also look into.
Wonderful. Marlies, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for choosing the European Respiratory Journal for this paper.
Thank you, James.
We love ILD, so everybody that's listening, do remember to send your very best papers on ILD to the European Respiratory Journal, and maybe you could be our next podcast guest. We'll be back next month with another paper so that we can continue to highlight the excellent science that's going on across respiratory medicine. Thanks so much for joining us this month. Goodbye.